Hey class, I want to talk to you today a little bit about Oladah Equiano's piece, The Interesting Narrative of Oladah Equiano. It's got a long name. They included in there that it was interesting, just in case you didn't think it was, they put that in the title. But this is actually a really interesting piece. To me, it's something I've taught several times in a lot of different contexts. I've taught it in a American literature class, as he did come to America at one point. I've taught it in a British literature class, and it has also fit into many of the African or Black literature courses as well, because he's really all of those things. But himself, he decided that London was his place, and he really liked to be in Great Britain. Now, the piece was written during what would have been probably one of the darkest ages, I suppose, in British time, because it's when the slave trade was at its peak. And we hear a lot that there were lots of different pieces of slavery throughout time, obviously in Egypt, and a lot of indentured servitude in North America, specifically the United States. But what a lot of people don't realize is that this was a business. And with slavery as a business, it was very difficult for people to find a way out. And I don't mean that simply by the slaves themselves, but any abolitionists who wanted to make movement to end the slave trade had a very hard time because it was so ingrained in our culture. Now, this is not something that I like to compare to anything in modern day, but if I was to at least make an attempt, I would probably compare it to the big oil companies, because with gasoline, that's something that's ingrained in our culture. We've got everything we do revolves around gasoline. If we got rid of all the gasoline, as they were trying to do with the abolitionists, if we were starting an abolitionist movement toward gasoline, what we'd have to do is stop driving. We would have to stop having things delivered. We couldn't take flights anywhere, and so on and so forth. Just imagine what would happen if we tried to abolish gasoline. And again, it's so ingrained in our culture, and that's how slavery was. They were anything cotton, anything that had sugar in it was gone. Okay, so how many of you right now aren't wearing cotton and haven't had any sugar today? So that's a fair question. It was ingrained in their society, and it was very difficult for any abolitionist to really have a very strong effect. But that's what Equiano was trying to do with his book. It was a huge book, very popular, especially in London area. And what we've gotten here is just an excerpt. All right, so as you read it, it's going to talk to you a little bit about his time on the Middle Passage. What's not included is his time in Africa. He was born in Africa. He lived in Africa until he was about 11 as a free tribesman. He was part of the Ibu tribe. If any of you are familiar with Chinua Achebe, he also was a member of the same tribe. Now, the reason that's interesting is because he was raised as a warrior in his tribe. He was, very civilized. They had a lot of things going on, but with this slave trade, things were not civilized. It turned tribe on tribe, and a lot of people would contribute to the slave trade because they didn't have money. Africa still has its problems, and at the time, it was not a strong nation, and the only thing they did have as resources were slaves for the slave trade. And so they would bring them to the coast, as you hear about Equiano, and they would sell them into the British slave trade. And the British slave trade was the strongest one. Very monetary based. A lot of people thought that it was, they justified it, called them nominal Christians, is what Equiano refers to in his book, because they would feel like, they're doing these Africans a favor because they were uncivilized. They might have as well thought that they were not Christian, and by bringing Christianity to these barbarians, they were doing them a favor. You justify what you have to justify. Okay. Now, as far as slavery itself, one thing that I want to mention is that it's mentioned in here, but one movie it's actually a book that was turned into a movie. It's called Amazing Grace. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the book by William Wilberforce, one of the great abolitionists in the British movement, as well as the song, though. I'm sure you've heard of the song. I'm not going to sing it for you. But if you go to church or a funeral or anything like that, you'd be familiar with Amazing Grace. Amazing Grace was actually written by a former slave ship owner turned preacher who felt that what he had done was so wrong that he wrote the song that he was saved by the Lord's amazing grace. If you look at the lines, amazing grace, how sweet the sound, and it talks and goes on, and saved a wretch like me. So he was repenting his sins of being a slave ship operator for the better part of probably 20 years, and was saying that only God saved him, and that's where he was. And this was a big support for William Wilberforce. And if you do get a chance to read the book or watch the movie, I strongly recommend it. Our boy Oladah Equiano is actually in it and plays a large part in there as well. But it shows it. And so slave trade was abolished by about the early 1800s. It was officially in law that it was to be gone. All right. So now, as far as the biography itself, one thing I've asked you guys to look at in your discussion board is what effect does it have that this is an autobiography? And when we talk about an autobiography, obviously I don't have to define it, but just in case, autobiography simply means that it's written by the person it's about. Okay? Now, one thing I'll tell you is if I was going to write my own autobiography, I'm not going to tell you all the hardships of my life that I don't like, you know? Let's say I was bullied when I was little. I'm not going to mention that, right? That's not a fun part. But I'm going to tell you about all the home runs I had in Little League. I'm going to go on to high school, tell you all my triumphs and everything else. And I'm going to gloss over the ugly stuff. At least that's the assumption. Something similar might be with Lance Armstrong's autobiography. He never mentioned much about the doping because it was an autobiography. Not a pretty part of his past, of course. And so one thing when they looked at this is, first of all, it's amazing that Equiano could write this in a time when slavery was so just like I said earlier, ingrained in the culture, but he wrote this and got it out. And it's an incredible feat that he came on a slave ship, came from Africa, and was able to write this in English and became essentially an English diplomat in many ways. But to think that it's an autobiography, what I ask you is, what effect would it have on the overall effectiveness of this? Because obviously if he writes it, it's different than if someone else did. So keep that in mind as you discuss. What effect does an autobiography have on a piece of writing itself? And is there maybe a way they should have said it wasn't an autobiography? The title is very long and tedious. And the book itself, you know, they give a lot of great imagery in here about what happened on that slave ship and the differences. To make a good comparison, he was worried about several things within it. He was worried that there was magic on the ship, right? When they stopped the ship at port, he thought it was magical because he'd never seen that before. He didn't understand the people that were capturing him. He'd never seen Europeans before. He was worried about their loose hair and their red skin, and to him it was very foreign, and he didn't know how they were treating him. He even mentions at one point he's afraid they might eat him. Okay? So imagine for us, this is like if someone came down and the Avatar guys were to capture us and put us on a ship and we don't know what's going on, okay? Very crazy stuff right there. And so with all this writing, I want you guys to take a deeper look at, first of all, the autobiography, but just the impact that this piece had, to think that it has influenced so many cultures, to be in an American literature class, a British literature class, as well as an African American studies class or a black literature class, okay? So it's a very important piece. And so when you guys read it, look at it that way. Some of the things I'm going to post into the folder, I want you guys to look at the map that I put in there. The map is actually of Equiano's travels. He was a very accomplished seafaring type, right? Because what happened with him is he became good at that. That was his trade. And as he became educated and Christian and all the things that made him civilized in the time period, based on the time period, he is someone who was very valuable to his owners. And so he could be leased out, essentially, to others, and he could do kind of anything he wanted when it came to the ship. He was very good. They complimented him a lot. So I'm going to have you look at the map and look at his travels. He's very impressed. You know, very impressive, his travels. He's seen everything. And so when he writes this, he has authority to explain not only what he's seen in his one trip on the ship, but he's been on the ship a lot. He's been at all these different areas. He's been all through the West Indies. He's been he's been to Africa. He's been everywhere. And essentially he's seen a lot, which makes him very credible for all this. Okay? So keep that in mind. It's important that he's a very credible source. Last thing I want to leave you guys with is just something to think about. What is it that you would do? Where would you start? Who would you talk to? What kind of effect might you have if you were trying to get rid of something as huge and as ingrained in the culture as slavery? All right? Where would you start? Who would you talk to? What could we do as just a small group of people? Because that's what this did. All right, this was very powerful. It helped get it to the king, right? Well, the queen, I suppose, and it get it through to everybody that it needed to be through, and it was very effective. So, what kind of writing would be effective? What kind of movement would be effective? And what are they going to do to get rid of all this? All right, guys, I really appreciate you guys paying attention. I tried to keep it right around 10 minutes because that's about as long as any good attention span can take. So I will be back next week, and I hope you guys can take a good few minutes to look at this and hit up the discussion boards. Have a good week. Thanks.